Another World Cup and another failure from the Brazilian national team. And then one has to wonder, why has Brazilian football declined so much? How bad is it actually? How much of the criticism is fair? And how much of it is just an overreaction? Has Brazil actually declined? Have they just been unlucky? What is going on? Today, I want to dive into all of that. Hello. If you're new here, I'm Filippo and welcome to Chapéu Football. And today, I want to dive into the Brazilian football crisis. Because, after Brazil loses the World Cup, it's very easy to blame one specific player or the coach. The issues go far deeper than that. And I'm not saying Ancelotti is not at fault or this player, that player, but that's just an oversimplification of it. Today I want to dive into the crisis, like what's happening, the reasons for this crisis, and possible long-term solutions. Because it is very funny when you're diving into Brazilian football, like the Brazilian clubs, they're richer than ever, they're doing better than ever, but the national team, it's been quite the opposite. And before we even start, I want us to cut the crap with one specific thing. Brazil won the World Cup in the 60s and 1970, right, in 1958. And then they won two World Cups in 1994 and 2002. The 1994 and 2002 World Cups where Brazil won, let's cut the crap. They did not win with Joga Bonito, okay? Let's just leave that out of the equation. Everyone's going to say, oh, Joga Bonito's dead since the 90s. Like, no. 1994 was not Joga Bonito, and 2002 was also not Joga Bonito, okay? With that said, make sure to share your thoughts in the comment section down below. Why do you think Brazilian football, or Brazilian national team, right? Not the clubs, but the national team, why are they doing worse than ever? Let me know your thoughts. Drop a like in this video. It's a great way to support the channel for free. Just drop a like right now. I'm waiting for it. And make sure to subscribe to the channel if you have not already. Okay, let's roll the intro and start the episode by talking about the crisis. Okay, so before we talk about the reasons, let's dive into the crisis. And for that, we have to dive into the results, like what's going on with Brazil. Have the results actually been that bad? And for that, I want to dive into what has Brazil accomplished ever since they won the World Cup in 2002, which is 24 years ago. So ever since Brazil won the 2002 World Cup, they have won 3 Copa Americas, one in 2004, one in 2007, and last but not least, which is kind of recent, right? They won the Copa America in 2019. Brazil has also won 3 Confederations Cup, one in 2005, one in 2009, and one in 2013. During this time, Brazil also won 2 Olympic gold medals. So when you really think about it, it hasn't really been that bad. Brazil also qualified to every single World Cup, always made it to the knockout rounds. The problem is, in Brazilian football, ultimately, you get judged based on how you do in the World Cup, and that's a big problem. In the World Cup, Brazil has not done great. Think about Tite for a second. He was in charge of Brazil in the 2018 cycle and 2022 cycle. Throughout the cycle, in World Cup qualifying, Copa America that he won, all of that, Tite actually did very well. But he failed in both World Cups, right, in 2018 and 2022. And that's where you get judged. So let's talk about Brazil over the past few World Cups. Okay, so from 2006 till now, Brazil has reached the semifinals only once, and that's not good enough for Brazil. And the only time they reached the semifinals, they were humiliated by Germany 7-1 at home. Which, if we're going to be completely honest, that's the biggest humiliation in Brazilian football history. That 7-1 loss to Germany in the Mineirão in Brazil in the 2014 World Cup. In all other editions besides the 2014 one, Brazil has lost the very first European side that they faced in the knockout rounds. All of them in the quarterfinals except for 2026, where Brazil was knocked out in the most recent World Cup in the round of 16. Coming into the 2026 World Cup, Brazil had their worst World Cup qualifying campaign ever. Yeah, it was the worst World Cup qualifying campaign. It was a mess. They had multiple coaches. Things did not go well. And the World Cup was also ultimately a disaster. And here's the thing. Brazil is now tied for its longest World Cup drought since 1930 to 1958, which is 28 years, right? Because if Brazil is to win a World Cup, the next one would be in 2030. But think about this. This is actually the worst World Cup drought for Brazil in their entire history. They've had 2, right? One from 1930 to 1958. But in between those World Cups, which is when it was starting, we had World War II. So we didn't have a few additions. So I don't think that one really counts. The other drought was from 1970 to 1994, which was 24 years. Now Brazil's going to go towards 28 years all the way till 2030. And just to be honest with you, looking at the generation coming up, I don't see how Brazil wins the 2030 World Cup. They're not bad players. They're talented. I just don't see Brazil as they'll be a contender. They'll have a shot in the 2030 World Cup. Brazil is always a contender. But I don't think the generation coming up is better than the team we had in 2018. And it's definitely not better than the team we had in 2022. But they'll be better than the one in 2026. And I want to make one thing clear. Now we're going to talk about the reasons, right, of why Brazil is struggling. I just want to say one thing from the get-go. It's not due to lack of talent. Brazil still has incredible players, very talented players that are succeeding in Europe. We'll talk about that in a second. So cut the crap on that as well. It's not due to a lack of talent. And as I said, ultimately, Brazil gets judged based on how they do in the World Cup. And for the past several World Cups, ever since 2006, Brazil has flopped and failed in every single edition. And now you're going to drop a like in this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And I am going to dive into the reasons of why Brazil is struggling so much, but only if you hit the like button, like right now, and subscribe. Okay, the reasons. Now, listen, I've seen a lot of Brazilians talking about the rise of evangelicals in Brazil and how there are less Catholics now, and that's one of the reasons why, from a cultural standpoint, the national team doesn't succeed anymore. I'll say this, I'm not evangelical myself, and I don't want to dive into religion in this video, but just being completely blunt and honest with you, I think that's just an excuse, okay? There are many reasons why Brazilian football is struggling. I do not believe religion is a reason, okay? Just to make that clear from the get-go. And even though they make some good points, I think that's just an excuse. They just don't know who to blame, and then all of a sudden religion became the issue. I just want to make that clear. So I'm not going to dive into that reason because I don't firmly believe it is a legitimate problem. All right, but you're entitled to your opinion. You're entitled to your excuses, so you can blame whatever you want. If you want to blame the rise of evangelicals in Brazil, that's fine. Reason number one, so let's dive into that. It's a bit of a cultural problem with Brazil as a country, and I'm going to say it. When it comes to like CBF and Brazilian football, CBF is the federation, Brazilian football is the entire thing, right? The entire, I guess, soccer or football ecosystem. There's a lot of corruption and political instability. So let's dive into that. So first and foremost, no one wants to talk about this, but the Brazilian national team and Brazilian youth football has been hijacked by agents and corporations. Like, think about this for a second. When it comes to youth football in Brazil, right, the academies, if you have the right agent, you can pretty much get into any academy you want, even if you're not an incredible talent, right? Of course, you can't just be a complete scrub and complete shit, but there's a lot of bang average players that gain access just because they have the right agent or daddy is the right politician. There's a lot of corruption going at that level. No one wants to talk about it. That is the reality. And ultimately what happens is the most talented players sometimes get left out. Very often at youth football in Brazil, it's more about who you know rather than how you play. I know it's uncomfortable to hear that, but it's true. Whether it is agents bribing youth coaches, agents or politicians bribing a football director of a club, whatever it is, that is the reality of Brazilian youth football these days. It's the truth. So we still manage to develop many talented players, but you get some nepotism, you get some entitled guys. And again, I even joke about this. Brazil used to have guys that were ruthless. Nowadays, the Brazilian soccer players are mostly like TikTok dancers. But anyhow, corruption at the youth level is insane, probably at all-time highs these days because of the transfer fees and how much money they can make. So that is a big issue. The other problem is political instability with the CBF, the Football Federation of Brazil. And it starts up top. And the problem is when you have instability up top, eventually that reaches the field. So let's talk about CBF real quick. If you don't have serious people working up top, as I said, the issues show up on the field. And for 7 consecutive terms, CBF had 5 presidents that were removed, banned, or arrested, which, let's be honest, that is nuts. That is insane. For example, Ricardo Teixeira, that was in charge of the Brazilian Federation for what, 2 decades almost, or even over 2 decades, he had to leave due to allegations of corruption, bribery, a bunch of nonsense, and that was back in 2012. And then in 2019, he ended up being banned from football by FIFA. Then you had José Maria Marim, that was arrested during the FIFA gate. Marco Polo Del Nero was banned due to corruption. There was also another guy that had to leave due to sexual harassment accusations. And most recently, we had Edinaldo Rodrigues. I made a whole video about this guy, so you guys can go check that out. It's also insane. And everything that I just told you about all these presidents, corruption, allegations, guys leaving, being banned, being arrested, all of that happened over the past 15 years. That's it. 15 years. Last but not least, when we talk about agents and corruptions, that has also reached the senior team levels, right? The professional teams. When you're watching a game, whether it is for club, national team, and you see that the coach made a very questionable decision, you're like, oh, he's stupid, he doesn't know football. They know football. The problem is, behind the scenes, there's agents working overtime, and there's a lot of bribery, a lot of money going on, and then coaches don't always select the best players for the roster, for the squad, for the starting 11. Now, I'm not saying Carlo Ancelotti did that, okay? I'm not saying he did that. I'm not saying previous Brazilian national team coaches also did that, right? Of taking certain players because a politician wanted it, because the president of CBF wanted it, because an agent wanted it, or because they took money. I'm not saying they did that, but I'm also not saying that they did not do that. So I'll leave it at that. Reason number 2 is the loss of the Brazilian identity, because it's not a talent problem, right? You look at, for example, the Champions League final, our 2 center backs, Gabriel Magalhães and Marquinhos, they were there. Vinicius Jr. is one of the best players in the world. Rodrigo wasn't in the World Cup, one of the best players as well, plays for Real Madrid. Rafinha is incredible for Barcelona. We have many good players, like Bruno Guimarães is a great midfielder in the Premier League. I can keep going, right? I can keep going. So it's not an issue with talent. There's talent. The problem is Brazil very often doesn't look like a cohesive team. They look like a bunch of talented individuals put together with different styles of play, different development, and different culture. Think about this for a second. Neymar was probably the last player that I've seen with the true essence of Brazilian football. The flair, ruthlessness. He wanted to be the protagonist. He played with joy and was also an incredible world-class generational talent. But the problem is the current players are not like that. I'm not even talking about talent level, because Neymar is a different type of talent. I'm talking about personality, the way they play, the way they express themselves, everything about it. And the question is, why has this happened? Why have the Brazilian players lost their identity, or they now have different identities and styles of play? Why is this happening? And to that, I'll tell you that there are 2 main reasons. One is money, right? Usually it's money, right? When we talk about corruption, money was the big issue, and European influence in the global game. So from the 90s beyond, more and more Brazilians started to go to Europe. And each decade, it started to get worse, and they start to go to Europe even earlier. Many of them leave these days when they're like 18 years old, right? That's been happening for like 10 to 15 years. And mind you, when I talk about Neymar, that didn't happen to him. Neymar stayed in Brazil until he was like 21, and he also went to Barcelona, which is a team that, from an identity standpoint, there are some similarities to Brazil, unlike Premier League teams, for example. And the problem with these players leaving so early is that when you're 18, you're still developing as a player, right? Tactically, technical standpoint, mindset, how you play, you're still developing. And the issue is you have players going to England, to France, to Spain, and getting different kinds of development when they're 18. And what does that happen? You have a Brazilian player playing more like an English player, like a Spanish player, like a French player. And when you bring all of these guys together, it doesn't look like a cohesive team. The Brazilian identity and essence of football, it's dead because of that. Along with all the European influence through the big leagues that all the young Brazilians watch in Brazil these days, social media, it's died. Like, if you look back to Brazil from the past, I'm not even talking about Joga Bonito. I'm not diving into that. As I said, 1994, 2002, that was not Joga Bonito. But the Brazilian players these days, they don't look, well, look-wise they do, but I'm just saying they don't play like Brazilian players. But it's not just that. If you think about like Brazilian youth football, we talked about the corruption, agents and all of that. The top Brazilian development clubs, they no longer develop Brazilian players to play in Brazil. They don't do that. They develop the players so they can sell them to Europe, more specifically, mostly La Liga and the Premier League. I have bigger issues with the Premier League because I think that's been terrible for the Brazilian players, and we've never had so many Brazilians playing in England. So the youth development in Brazil these days, it's not meant to feed the national team or to even feed Brazilian clubs. You're not developing players for that. You're developing them so you can sell them, let's say, to the Premier League. And that, unfortunately, changes the entire approach of how you develop players, the characteristics and attributes you look for, also the positions, right? You're not going to sell a fullback. So you're like, why has Brazil stopped developing fullbacks? Well, because unlike forwards and attacking midfielders, even center backs, you can't sell a fullback for 60 million euros, 40 million euros. That doesn't really happen. And it's funny because when you think about it, the Brazilian clubs in Brazil, they are richer than ever, and they've never dominated South America like they do these days. But the national team, on the other hand, Doesn't look like its old self. And lastly, when I talk about identity, just look at Brazil and the coaches they've had over the past like 15 years, right? We've had coaches that are more free-flowing, things are a bit more fluid, and they play a little bit more the Brazilian style of play. That didn't work. Then you had Chichi in charge of the national team. He implemented more of like positional play. I thought the team had stability, it was pragmatic, but Brazil actually didn't look bad under Chichi, but ultimately in the World Cup, the positional play didn't work. Identity crisis right there. Now Carlo Ancelotti comes in and he tries a reactive approach, something we haven't seen very often with Brazil, if ever, right? If ever. Maybe the most similar thing we have seen from the 2026 team was probably 1994, right? It was more of a defensive structured team. That also didn't work. What is Brazil's identity? What is it? Like, try to put it into words, not what Brazil was from the past, but what is Brazil's identity right now? Can you actually put it into words in the comment section? I doubt it. Reason number 3, and this one might be also a little bit uncomfortable for Brazilians to hear, and I lived in Brazil for many years, and I've coached Brazilian players in the TST, the $1 million tournament, some incredible players, by the way. I think Brazilians are a little bit too emotional. And that is a mentality issue. So what I'm going to give you as an example here. For the Brazilian national team, there's a lot of pressure to perform because of Brazil's past, right? The legends we've had, the World Cups we've won. So there's a lot of pressure on these players. And Brazilian players used to be fearless, ruthless, arrogant, a little bit like Neymar, which honestly, as a player, that's a good thing. The new players, they're more of like TikTok dancers than actual players. The Brazilian players are no longer ruthless like the ones from the past. And I know this may sound just kind of like lazy as an analysis, but look at Brazil's eliminations from the World Cups from, I would say, 2006 beyond. There's always been moments of like mental lapses. And then Brazil just breaks down and loses the game. It's never because we go toe-to-toe with the opponent and then I don't know, just like we lose because they're just so much better than us. 2006, that one was weird. That team didn't seem to take the World Cup seriously. There was a lot of talent in that team and they lost. 2010, Brazil dominated the Dutch in the first half. In the second half, they had like 10-15 minutes of a mental lapse between Júlio César, Felipe Melo, and ultimately that led to 2 goals, right? Schneider scored off a header. That was ridiculous. And Felipe Melo got a red. All right, mentality, a problem. 2014, Brazil lost Neymar and Thiago Silva to play against Germany. Complete meltdown for that game. That Brazilian team is not 7-1 worse than Germany. But you could tell that this team was always nervous in every game. Brazil should have lost to Chile in the round of 16. They were shaky every game. 2018 against Belgium, that Brazilian team was very good. But again, against Belgium, what was it, like 20 minutes of a complete mental collapse and Belgium got a 2-0 lead? Then after that, Brazil dominated Belgium. But those like 15 minutes, those fine margins are what makes it or breaks it in the World Cup. 2022, again, Brazil was playing very well in the World Cup. Brazil was great, right? They were doing well. And then against Croatia, Neymar scores a brilliant goal. In like 2 or 3 minutes, Brazil has a mental lapse, Croatia scores. And what happens after that? Brazil chokes on penalty shootouts. Mentality. 2026, well, again, that was a little bit of mentality, but there was a lack of quality in certain positions, and ultimately that's why Brazil lost to Norway, a team with Erling Haaland, a player that's actually ruthless. And last but not least, reason number 4, this is not why Brazil hasn't won the World Cup, but people were asking, why has Brazil started to lose to teams like Croatia, right? Started to lose to Belgium, even though Belgium was very good. That was peak of their golden generation. Brazil lost to Norway. And to that, I'll say reason number 4 is the world has caught up. Now, Brazil is not a tier 2 team like for example, Croatia, Norway. Brazil's somewhere in between right now, tier 1 and tier 2. They're like in between, okay? Brazil's no longer like the top of the top. I think Spain's ahead. France is definitely ahead. I would argue that England right now is ahead. Argentina, based on results over the past like 5 years, they're clearly ahead of Brazil. But ultimately, the world has caught up. So these teams right now, like Norway, Croatia, Morocco, they can all challenge the current version of Brazil. So I don't think when Brazil loses to Norway, the way people were saying, this is unacceptable, it's a bit of an upset based on history. But when you go player by player and what they have, like Erling Haaland is better than any Brazilian player right now. Martin Odegaard is better than any Brazilian midfielder right now. So when you look at it from that perspective, it's not that big of an upset. So the world has caught up like teams like Japan, Morocco, Norway, they've all improved drastically. While Brazil, I don't think Brazil has regressed so much. It's more of like what I talked about, mentality, lack of identity and instability up top. But Brazil also hasn't improved, right? Brazil's definitely not more talented than they were many, many years ago. I don't think they're that much worse like people try to portray, but they're not more talented, while these teams have gotten better. The floor has gone up. So those are the 4 main reasons, in my opinion. You can let me know yours in the comment section down below. Now I want to talk about how do we fix it, okay? How can we fix this over the long run? There's no magic bullet, but what I want to say right now is for you to drop a like in this video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. So obviously, one way to fix it is to try to clean up the mess that's Brazilian football. Like I said, at the corruption level, agents, politicians, all of that. Now, that's easier said than done, and because it's Brazil, I don't think it's realistic to end corruption, okay? So I'm not even going to dive into that. Ending corruption is obvious, and I don't think it'll happen. So I'm not going to say that. But what can be done that can maybe help us overcome all those issues specifically? One, we probably need a national academy, right? That comes from the federation. That way you can identify players from all over Brazil, all right, help them develop, give them a platform, and stop the whole corruption with agents nonsense. We get the best of the best and we place them there. Norway has done that. France did it, okay, and France is now the best national team in the world. Brazil already has the infrastructure for that at the Granja Comari. That's the headquarters for the Brazilian Federation. What I think Brazil needs now is that, a national academy, an identity, bring back the Brazilian players to Brazil, if that makes any sense. Make the Brazilian players Brazilian again. I'm not trying to copy Donald Trump's quote right there, but that might be the best way to go about it. Make Brazilian players Brazilian again. And I also think when it comes to the Brasileirão, the Brazilian league, there has to be some kind of regulations from the Brazilian Football Federation to try to hold Brazilian players to stay in Brazil for longer, whether it is homegrown rules, decrease the amount of foreign players in the Brazilian league. There's a lot of foreign players these days. They're great players, but reduce the number. We have to find a way to try to keep the Brazilian player in Brazil until they're 21, 22. That is actually kind of important, okay? So they can identify with the country more, develop in Brazil, and we recreate that Brazilian identity. Now, it doesn't mean they should never go to Europe. That's fine. We can still sell them. You still have to make money. But CBF and the Federation have to find ways to regulate it so that players are not leaving when they're 18, 19, or 20. They stay till they're 21, 22, 23. Some of them stay forever. The Brazilian clubs are richer than ever. So is it possible? Absolutely. But anyhow, those are the main things I'll try to tackle right now, right? It's developing a national academy and regulations in the Brazilian league to keep the Brazilian players there for much longer than they do now. Now, in terms of the corruption part, I don't know what to do about that. That's a Brazil problem that goes beyond soccer, beyond football. I don't know how to solve that. All right, everyone, that's my take on the crisis that Brazilian football currently lives. It's unfortunate. I hope they bounce back. I don't think they'll bounce back in 2030, but I'm very hopeful for the future, 2034, 2038, and beyond. I want to thank you all very much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe and drop a like in this video, and have a great day.